one common usage of function is trigger. So a function can be triggered by a certain event. So when you have a database table and you insert or delete or update, you are making physical change to the table, right? Or you are doing an auto table, adding a column or modifying a column or dropping a column. Either way, you are changing the table or you are changing the data physically. So this is the event. Anytime this kind of a change happens, this is the event. If you are just selecting, you are not changing the table, then there's no event. But for insert, update, delete, and alter, there are physical change and there are events happening. And this event can trigger the execution of a certain function. These triggers, when the event happens, there's always some data moving around, data change, right? So for insert, there's no previous data. You are adding a new data to it. And for delete, you have old data. Once you delete the data, there's no new data. But for update, you may have old data and have a new data. The old data was the one before the update, and the new data is the one after the update. So triggers, as they are triggered by the event, they have the access to previous data, to old data, and the new data, both of them. For us, for a regular SQL, when you run insert, you will only be able to access the new data. Once your insert happens, you only be able to access the new data. Once the update happens, you will only be able to access new data. The old is gone. But for trigger, they have the right to access old data as well as the new data. And they can do some manipulations, like for validation. If the new data is okay, can I do this insert? If the new data matches certain criteria, can I do this update if the new data matches certain quality criteria? So these are the things that trigger can do for data integrity, and maybe for more operations. If there are certain logic, like if the new data is like this and that, then I can do some additional performance for doing some additional logic. So for trigger to happen, for you to define a trigger, you need to create a function, of course. But this function has to be returning a trigger data type. That's the only thing that's different. And inside the function, you will be able to use a data set, a table called old, and a table called new. Both old and new have the same data structure as the table that the trigger was relied on. So if you have defined a trigger on the instructor table, the old table data set, the old relation in the trigger function, and as well as a new relation in the trigger function, will have the same instructor data type as the instructor table. If the trigger is defined on employee table, then the old and the new data set will have the same structure as the employee table, right? And the old database, the old table, of course, will contain the old data if there's any. If it's a delete or update, of course, you have old data. If it's insert, of course, there's no old data. Similarly, for new, you will have new data if this is insert or update. If it's a delete, then you won't have new data. Then once you have the function ready, you will create a trigger to define the table involved, which table you want to work on, and the event involved. Is that are you going to trigger the function on insert or update or delete? Each must be defined. And then you need to define which trigger function you are going to invoke when the event happens. So 2 steps: define the function and the associated function with the event and with the table and the table event. Now, let's take a look at some examples. I have created the instructor table. So now, first thing first, let's create the function, the trigger function. So the trigger function, I'm defining the trigger function here. As you can see, it's the same. The first line is the same as all other functions. You will do a function update instructor, and this tells us that this trigger will be used. This function will be used when there is an update to the instructor table. Now, it will return the trigger function, which is required. Then inside S block, everything is the same, just that it's going to select a affiliations explanation, a description of the instructor affiliation into our variable. Then I will print out the instructor name, the instructor affiliation description. The instructor is from light side or dark side, right? And which is defined by the instructor affiliation field in the table. Now, and you can see that what I'm doing is the new. I use a new here. I don't care what the old is in this particular example. You maybe, if you want, you can use the old for some additional logic. All I'm saying is if the new table, new instructor affiliation is Jedi. Now, note that I'm defining the trigger on update of a table. So you might be updating a name, the instructor name, but still this trigger will be triggered. And when we do this function, when we run this function, the logic will be just checking, will not check which column gets updated. Instead, we are just getting a printout for the affiliation, right? So this is the function. Anytime the instructor table gets updated, we will run that and print out a description of the updated instructor's affiliation. Now let's create the trigger. We're going to create a trigger called update instructor trigger, and after update happen, you can define whether this is a before update or after update, right? And if it's a before update, of course, you may want to check the old data. Then after update, you can check both old and new. Now, on instructor table and execute procedure. It's called execute procedure, but it actually is a function. This is just a leftover from Postgres history. And we define so we create a trigger and associate the event, the table of the table, to a function. Now let's run this. And then let's update the instructor name to Obi-Wan Kenobi to Ben Kenobi. And you can see that as we run this, we are getting this notice. The instructor is from light side of factor, right? It's properly triggered and print out. Now let's look at the instructor table. And you can see that this is properly updated. Now, get back to the PowerPoint slide. There's one thing to note is trigger may have serious performance implication. Every time you do insert, every time you do update, you run this function, this all takes time. So trigger, while it's useful, it can come with a performance hit. You need to really check whether your trigger is worthwhile. So for example, if you are inserting a large chunk of data into the table, then is it worth it to check every row? Or would that be easier actually to dump data into a staging area and run the store procedure once for all to check all the rows, and then dump those checked data into your target data? So these are the things that you need to consider as the more advanced a SQL developer. And this is why we put this information in the advanced SQL part.